The Treasury doors are closed, guarded by Persian officials in pressed uniforms, their presence formal and disciplined. Inside, ledgers lie open beneath hanging lamps. Columns of figures stretch across the pages. Ink dries on reports written in a careful foreign hand. The room looks Persian. The authority inside it no longer is. What appears to be routine administration masks a deeper shift that few outside these walls fully grasp. The common belief is simple and familiar. Persia lost control through invasion, weakness, or backwardness. A declining empire, overwhelmed by stronger powers. That explanation is neat, but it misses the quieter truth. Persia was not seized by force. It was hollowed out from within, invited by its own need for order, reform, and cash. Think about that. No army crossed the borders to take the treasury. It was handed over, line by line, under the promise of stability. This transfer did not feel like surrender at the time. It felt responsible. Persia faced mounting pressures that could not be ignored. Revenues fluctuated. Debts accumulated. Administration strained under the weight of modernization. The state needed predictability, not spectacle. Solutions arrived wearing the language of expertise rather than threat. Advice replaced demands. Oversight replaced coercion. The shift felt technical, even benign. The stakes were existential because money is never just money. Whoever controls revenue controls the state's choices. Taxes determine loyalty. Spending determines power. The ability to move funds decides whether a government can act independently or merely react. When control over money changes hands, sovereignty follows, even if ceremonies and titles remain untouched. Persia still appeared sovereign. The monarchy stood. Orders were issued. Flags flew above ministries. Diplomacy continued. From the outside, nothing dramatic had changed. That appearance mattered. It allowed the transition to proceed without panic or resistance. Authority did not vanish overnight. It drifted. Behind palace walls and ministry desks, decisions were being reframed. What could be afforded? What could be delayed? What required approval? These questions increasingly pointed beyond Persia's own institutions. The shift was subtle enough to avoid confrontation, yet steady enough to be irreversible. Power was not removed. It was redirected. This story matters because it reveals a form of takeover that hides behind competence. Control does not always arrive with conquest. Sometimes it arrives with spreadsheets, audits, and assurances. It presents itself as help. It promises reform without loss. But reform has a price, and that price is often autonomy. Imagine the appeal of order in a system under strain. Predictable budgets, stable revenues, clear procedures. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a state trying to survive modern pressures. Persia did not invite oversight out of ignorance. It did so out of necessity. That necessity created an opening that force never could. The central question drives everything that follows. How does a government remain independent when it no longer manages its own money? Titles can be preserved. Institutions can remain standing. Laws can still be passed. But if the Treasury answers elsewhere, choice narrows quickly. Independence becomes ceremonial. This was not a story of betrayal in secret tunnels or midnight deals. Contracts were signed in daylight. Agreements were debated openly. The language was respectful. The tone was professional. Control changed hands politely, permanently, without a single shot fired. That is what made it so effective. Persia's leaders believed they were buying time and stability. What they purchased instead was constraint. Each concession was justified as temporary. Each adjustment was framed as technical. No single step felt decisive. Together, they formed a structure that shifted authority away from those meant to wield it. The guards remained at the doors. The seals remained on the documents. The rituals of state continued uninterrupted. Yet inside the numbers told a different story. Decisions were increasingly shaped by external expectation rather than internal priority. The Treasury still existed. It simply no longer belonged fully to the state it served. This is how sovereignty can erode without collapse, how power can be lost without defeat. Persia did not fall in a moment of chaos. It bent in a period of reform. The danger was not visible because it wore the face of improvement. The ink on those reports dried quietly. No announcement followed. No protest erupted. But with each page completed, authority shifted further away. The takeover was already complete by the time anyone thought to resist. And that is the lesson embedded in these closed doors. Control surrendered willingly is far harder to reclaim than control defended openly. For generations, Persia projected endurance. Its monarchy commanded loyalty rooted in tradition and ritual. Court ceremonies reinforced continuity, even as the world around it accelerated. The land itself carried weight, positioned along trade routes that linked empires, caravans crossing deserts with goods, news, and silver. This geography translated into leverage. Persia was not isolated. It was connected, and connection meant relevance. Customs revenues flowed through ports and caravan cities, forming a reliable pillar of state income. Taxes were collected across provinces by officials who represented the crown's authority. Salaries were paid. Garrisons were supplied. The machinery of government, while imperfect, functioned. Persia negotiated with foreign powers as an equal, balancing interests through diplomacy rather than submission. To many observers, this was a state managing transition, not decline. Reform movements reflected that confidence. They aimed to modernize administration, streamline collection, and improve efficiency. The goal was not surrender. It was control. Ministries expanded to meet new demands. Records became more formal. Procedures were standardized. Each reform promised greater order and predictability, qualities prized in an era where power increasingly flowed through systems rather than personalities. Imagine the atmosphere in Tehran's government halls during this period. Debates over budgets, railways, and reforms filled long sessions. Advisors spoke of modernization with cautious optimism. Officials believed that learning from foreign models could strengthen the state without weakening its authority. After all, many empires had modernized this way. Expertise was not viewed as a threat. It was a resource. Foreign influence existed, but it appeared limited and technical. Advisors were consulted, not obeyed. Recommendations were weighed, not imposed. The assumption was clear. Persia would remain the final decision-maker. Outside knowledge would serve domestic goals. The boundary between assistance and authority felt well-defined. Confidence followed from that assumption. Persia still issued orders, collected revenue, and commanded obedience. Laws were enforced. The courts functioned. The treasury operated under Persian seals. Nothing suggested loss of control. The system looked intact because it was still functioning. Everyday governance continued without interruption, reinforcing the belief that sovereignty was secure. Internationally, Persia was treated as a state navigating reform, not one under supervision. Diplomatic correspondence maintained formal equality. Trade agreements were negotiated rather than dictated. Foreign powers sought influence, but influence is not the same as control. The distinction mattered, and Persia believed it understood where the line stood. That belief shaped decisions. Efficiency became the watchword. Predictable revenue mattered more as global competition intensified. Fluctuations in income were no longer acceptable inconveniences. They were risks. As financial pressures grew, order became more valuable than autonomy in the short term. A well-run system promised stability, and stability promised survival. The appeal of administrative improvement was powerful because it produced visible results. Collections improved. Waste was reduced. Accounts appeared clearer. These outcomes reinforced the idea that reform was working. When systems deliver, they earn trust. That trust extended to those who helped design them. From the outside, Persia looked capable of managing change on its own terms. Its institutions were evolving. Its leadership appeared engaged rather than overwhelmed. Foreign expertise seemed integrated, not dominant. This perception mattered. It reduced alarm and delayed resistance. No one rushes to defend sovereignty when it appears intact. Strength on the surface masked dependence underneath. As reforms deepened, certain functions became harder to reverse. Procedures replaced discretion. Standards replaced judgment. The more the system relied on technical consistency, the more it leaned on those who defined that consistency. Authority shifted incrementally, hidden inside process. Financial pressures amplified this trend. Shortfalls demanded solutions that were immediate and credible. External advice offered both. Each recommendation carried the weight of international approval. Accepting it signaled responsibility. Rejecting it risked instability. The calculus favored cooperation, even when it narrowed freedom. This was not coercion. It was alignment. Persia aligned its practices with expectations that originated elsewhere. The alignment felt voluntary because it was framed as improvement. The state still chose, but the range of acceptable choices was quietly shrinking. Autonomy remained in form, not in substance. Nothing in this phase suggested occupation or collapse. The monarchy remained. The ministries operated. The Treasury opened and closed on schedule. Guards still stood at the doors. That continuity reassured everyone involved. Control, it seemed, was firmly in Persian hands. Yet the door had opened, not to invasion, but to oversight. The braking mechanism arrived without ceremony, carried in the language of fiscal supervision. Foreign advisors were invited to stabilize budgets, manage debts, and reassure creditors who had grown uneasy. Their presence was justified as temporary and technical. They came to review accounts, identify inefficiencies, and recommend corrections. At first, their role appeared narrow. Advice was offered. Reports were filed. Persian officials remained at their desks. But financial pressure has a way of expanding authority. Revenues tightened as obligations grew. Cash shortages threatened payrolls and basic administration. Loans were requested to smooth the strain, and loans arrived with conditions attached. Conditions required verification. Verification required access. What began as guidance turned into oversight, not through force, but through procedure. Advisors began reviewing accounts in detail. They traced revenue flows, audited collections, and examined expenditures line by line. This scrutiny was framed as professionalism. Transparency would restore confidence. Confidence would unlock credit. The logic was difficult to resist. Each step promised relief, even as it narrowed control. Soon, recommendations became prerequisites. Spending plans required approval to ensure compliance with agreed targets. Revenue streams were reorganized to guarantee predictability. Customs receipts, taxes, and Treasury disbursements were structured to satisfy external expectations before domestic priorities. The state still collected its money, but it could not freely decide how to use it. Pressure built steadily behind closed doors. Financial instability justified deeper involvement. Deeper involvement exposed weaknesses that demanded correction. Correction required authority. The cycle reinforced itself. Oversight did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, embedded in processes that became harder to unwind with each passing month. The turning point came when key revenue streams could no longer be altered without foreign approval. Adjustments to customs rates, tax allocations, or spending schedules required consent beyond Persia's own institutions. This was not announced publicly. It did not need to be. The effect was felt internally, where decisions slowed and options disappeared. Cause and effect were relentless. Financial instability justified supervision. Supervision reduced sovereignty. Reduced sovereignty limited political choice. Each stage fed the next, creating a structure that functioned smoothly while shifting power outward. Persian officials remained in place, but their discretion shrank. Titles were preserved. Authority was not. Ask what it means when a state cannot spend without permission. Laws may still be passed. Decrees may still be issued. But if the Treasury cannot act independently, governance becomes conditional. Policy turns into compliance. Priorities are set not by need, but by obligation. As oversight expanded, priorities shifted subtly. Creditor confidence took precedence over domestic demand. Stability was defined externally. Reforms were evaluated by their effect on balance sheets rather than society. The state's energy turned toward satisfying requirements that ensured continued access to funds. Resistance carried immediate financial consequences that Persia could not absorb. This mechanism worked because it appeared rational, orderly, and legal. There were no ultimatums shouted across borders. There were deadlines, benchmarks, and audits. Everything operated within agreements that Persia had accepted. Each measure could be defended as necessary. Together, they transferred control. No collapse followed. That was the point. The system functioned too well to provoke alarm. Salaries were paid. Administration continued. The Treasury doors opened each morning as usual. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Internally, the center of gravity had moved. The advisors did not replace Persian officials. They overshadowed them. Decisions were shaped before they reached the table. Options were filtered in advance. What remained was choice within constraint. The state could act, but only along approved lines. Autonomy existed in form, not in substance. Resistance was costly. Challenging oversight risked credit suspension. Delays in approval threatened payrolls and basic services. Each act of defiance carried immediate consequences, while compliance promised continuity. The calculus favored submission, even among those who recognized the loss it entailed. The Treasury still existed. Its seals were intact. Its records were meticulously kept. Yet it answered to someone else. Authority had been relocated through spreadsheets, audits, and signatures. Control did not need to be declared. It was exercised. This was financial power at its most refined. It did not abolish institutions. It repurposed them. It allowed sovereignty to persist ceremonially while emptying it operationally. The state remained visible. Decision-making moved elsewhere. By the time the full extent of this shift became clear, reversal was difficult. The system was locked in by dependence. Budgets were calibrated to oversight. Revenues were structured to meet conditions. Any attempt to reclaim control threatened instability the state could not risk. The mechanism had done its work. Persia had not been conquered. It had been supervised into submission. The process required patience, credibility, and leverage. It succeeded because it looked like reform. The Treasury was never seized by force. It was redefined by agreement. And once financial control slipped away, political sovereignty followed, quietly and decisively. The consequences reshaped the state in ways that could not be hidden forever. Public trust eroded as policies increasingly served external expectations rather than domestic priorities. Taxes were collected with greater efficiency, yet living conditions failed to improve as promised. A growing gap opened between the language of reform and the experience of daily life. People sensed that decisions affecting them were no longer fully theirs. Reforms lost legitimacy because their purpose felt misplaced. Projects were justified by balance sheets, not by social need. Spending was constrained where it was most visible, while obligations to creditors remained untouched. The population bore the cost through austerity, delayed development, and rising pressure on households. The state appeared disciplined, yet disconnected from those it governed. Nationalists and reformers, often divided in outlook, arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. Persia was paying the price of control without the benefits of independence. One group saw betrayal. The other saw structural weakness. Both recognized that sovereignty had thinned. The argument was no longer about modernization versus tradition. It was about who truly decided. Political unrest grew gradually, fueled by the sense that authority had been sold quietly. There was no single moment of outrage. Discontent accumulated as policies repeated themselves without delivering relief. When frustration surfaced, it was not directed at advisors alone, but at a system that seemed unresponsive. The state enforced decisions it did not fully own, and that contradiction became visible. Over time, the presence of foreign supervision became normalized, then resented. Officials spoke of necessity and obligation. Citizens heard loss and dependency. The advisors eventually left, their contracts ending as circumstances shifted. Their departure did not restore control. The damage had already been done. Institutions had been rewired to prioritize external approval over internal consent. The Treasury still functioned, but its logic had changed. Procedures remained aligned with expectations set elsewhere. Habits formed under supervision persisted. Financial caution replaced initiative. Decision-making avoided risk, even when risk was required for growth. The system had learned to protect stability above all else, including autonomy. The long-term lesson was brutal in its clarity. Financial dependence invites political dependence. A state that cannot manage its own money cannot fully manage its future. Persia's experience echoed beyond its borders and its time. Other states watched and learned, sometimes too late, as modernization under pressure carried hidden costs. Control does not always arrive with flags and troops. Sometimes it arrives with expertise and reassurance. It speaks the language of order and reform. It promises to strengthen institutions while quietly redirecting their purpose. The Treasury was seized without being emptied. Authority was lost without being declared. The population paid the price in stalled development and constrained choice. Roads were planned, then postponed. Investments were discussed, then delayed. The sense of possibility narrowed. What had been framed as a temporary adjustment hardened into a permanent condition. Independence existed on paper. In practice, it was limited by approval. Reclaiming financial control proved far harder than defending it would have been. Once systems were built around oversight, removing that oversight threatened collapse. Dependence became self-enforcing. Any attempt to assert autonomy risked instability the state could not absorb. The cost of resistance rose with each year of compliance. Persia's story became a warning studied by those navigating similar pressures. It showed how easily sovereignty can be traded for order, and how difficult it is to reverse that trade. Modernization financed by dependence carries a price that is rarely paid up front. It is paid later in diminished choice. The Treasury doors eventually reopened under Persian authority. Guards still stood watch. Records were kept. Yet something fundamental had changed. Authority no longer flowed naturally from revenue to policy. It was filtered through expectations set beyond the state. That shift defined the aftermath more than any single reform or protest. This is not a story of inevitable decline. It is a story of sequence. Need led to advice. Advice led to oversight. Oversight led to control. Each step was defensible. Together, they transformed governance. Persia did not collapse. It was constrained. The lesson endures because the mechanism endures. States seeking stability often accept conditions that narrow freedom. The danger lies not in seeking help, but in surrendering control over the instruments of rule. Money is one of those instruments. Once it answers elsewhere, independence becomes symbolic. Persia's experience reminds us that power can move quietly, hidden inside systems designed to appear neutral. When financial control is surrendered, political authority follows, whether acknowledged or not. The cost is paid